Good day, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 edition of the Current Issues Plenary. I'm glad that some of you could make it. The theme for this year's conference emphasizes resistance and renewal. I could not think of a more appropriate theme than this one. I would like to thank the co-chairs for this conference, Professors Gretchen Bauer and Akosio Dakwa, for inviting me to be the speaker for this year's Current Issues Plenary. As you may have heard from the introduction, I work with a team of talented researchers and advocates across Africa to ensure that the decisions and actions by governments, policy and development actors, researchers, and other stakeholders are informed by the views, aspirations, and experiences of ordinary Africans. We regularly collect, analyze, and widely disseminate data on the experiences of ordinary Africans in more than 30 countries on the continent. We pride ourselves in the fact that we are the go-to source for high-quality data on what Africans are thinking. We believe that African societies thrive when African voices count in public policy and development. And that is our vision. I'm glad that a large and growing number of Africa scholars use our data in research and teaching. And I like to use the platform to encourage those who do not know us or have never used our data to visit our website and try out our data analysis tool. The vision of the Afrobarometer, as I stated earlier, aligns very strongly with the theme for this year's conference. If we want to recenter Africa, as it is stipulated in the conference theme, then we must put the African people at the center of it all. Their views, their experiences, their evaluations, and their aspirations, among others, must be at the center of our discourse. This is why I think the decision by the co-chairs to feature the Afrobarometer makes perfect sense. We cannot talk about resistance and renewal on the continent without grounding it in the realities of ordinary people on the continent. In fact, it would be a missed opportunity if we did so. And that is why I believe featuring the Afrobarometer and bringing the voices of ordinary people to bear on the discussions we have at this conference is important and timely. With that in mind, I will not do this plenary any justice if I do not draw on some of the results of the Afrobarometer to tell a few stories. As some of you may already know, our surveys cover a wide range of topics, and we conduct the surveys on regular cycles, usually about every other year. And for each survey, we add new topics to capture debates on current issues. And that's where the relevance of the Afrobarometer comes in to the current issues plenary here today. For the sake of those who do not know the Afrobarometer, I'm going to start off by giving you a very high-level overview of the project itself. I will follow this with a brief commentary and highlights of the results that speak to the concept of resistance and resilience. In the final section of my presentation, I will share a few examples of the use of the Afrobarometer data in policy decisions and actions in selected countries, and conclude with a short video clip about how the Afrobarometer, or the extent to which the Afrobarometer actually goes to collect this data. So starting off with the general overview of the Afrobarometer, we are a Pan-African non-partisan survey research network. We work in more than 30 countries, as you can see in this map. We started off in 1999 with 12 countries. The countries shaded in orange are the countries we originally started with. And we have worked across 39 countries since in the last 2 decades. The latest country that we worked in was Angola, which is colored in green here. And for all of these countries, what we do is to track the views, experiences, and evaluations of ordinary Africans, as I indicated earlier. And we bring these findings into policy processes at national, continental, and global levels. In terms of our country selection, we have some basic criteria we use to enter a country. As you will have noticed from the display of the map here, we do not work in all countries. And that is because we need certain basic minimum conditions to be fulfilled before we can work in any country. And there are primary factors, which include having sufficient political openness, adequate sampling frame, and the availability of a national investigator. Other considerations are safety and security, getting clearance from the government. Of course, sometimes man-made and natural disasters interrupt our surveys, and as well as funding. Regarding our methodology, we use nationally representative samples, and this is why we need for one of the basic requirements that a country has a good sampling frame. Without that, we cannot draw a truly random sample. All our respondents are selected randomly, and the sample is distributed proportionately by region, state, province, urban and rural, and other demographic characteristics. We also strive to ensure that our sample is balanced by gender. And so for each country, we would usually have 50% male and 50% female respondents. Every adult citizen, per our protocols and sampling procedure, has an equal chance of being selected. In terms of the surveys themselves, we conduct face-to-face surveys, interviews, I should say, and we do so in the language, the choice of the language of the respondents. We allow the respondents to choose the language they want to be interviewed in, and we interview them in that language. We use a standard questionnaire that allows us to compare across countries and over time, and the sample sizes are usually 1,200 or 2,400, depending on the complexity of the country. And of course, in statistical terms, this gives us margin of sampling error of about ±2 or ±3 at the 95% confidence level. In terms of the topics we cover, here they are. So we have a standard set of topics that we cover from survey round to the next. And this allows us to track over time some of the developments on these indicators or on these topics. And then for each survey round, we include a special set of topics for which are relevant for current debates. So for example, we're going into the 9th round of the surveys, and the emphasis for the 9th round will be on climate change and environmental governance. We also cover the COVID-19 issues, as well as police professionalism. And these are issues we pick up because they are the topical issues of the day that are being debated in policy discourse and in development discourse. And as I said, I'm happy to respond to any questions that people may have about the Afrobarometer in relevant. But for now, I would want to turn to the main substance of the discussion today. On the concept of resistance, when I started to prepare for this plenary session, I looked up the definition of resistance. And of course, several of them came up, but one particular one went as follows. A situation in which people or organizations fight against something or refuse to accept or be changed by something. In our surveys, we realized, and I realized that both of these aspects of the definition of resistance, which is fighting against something on one hand, or refusing to accept or be changed by something on the other, are highly visible and they reflect in our survey results. I would shortly show you what I mean by that. But as we all know, resistance, as we all know, can take many forms, ranging from overt expressions, such as a street protest, to more subtle and silent expressions. Of course, one cannot speak of resistance without touching on resilience. That's why I started off by saying the results I present will touch on both resistance and resilience. I will start with the governance front. And by this, I'll be touching on both economic governance and political governance. We may all have heard by now the refrain that democracy is on the decline globally. On the face of it, this is indisputable. Of course, events in several countries, including Benin, Guinea, Bolivia, Brazil, the United States, Turkey, Nicaragua, Mauritius, and the list goes on. All of these challenges that these countries have faced have signaled the vulnerability of democracy and reinforced the view that democracy is on the decline globally. And you cannot begrudge that. But at the Afrobarometer, we always argue that we need to separate the demand side of democracy from the supply side of democracy. And I'll explain what I mean by those two terms. But with the supply side of democracy, we mean governments and elected leaders actually supplying democracy and delivering on democratic norms and values. And on the demand side, here we mean citizens actually demanding a democracy and being committed to democratic values and norms as well. And so when we look at democracy and want to judge whether or not democracy is declining across the globe, we will need to look at both the demand side and the supply side and look at them separately. So data from the Afrobarometer and what we have observed over time, at least over the last decades, is that the democratic decline discourse is more about a supply issue than a demand side issue. The demand side of democracy and democratic norms is very robust and stable across Africa, despite the large supply deficit. This is one of the signs of resilience and popular resistance to the wind of democratic decline on the continent. Africans have largely stood by democracy and democratic norms, despite its weaknesses. And here, let me just show you the first cut of our data. For this particular question, we ask respondents to choose between three statements. One, that democracy is preferable to any kind of government, or that the second statement, in some circumstances, a non-democratic government can be preferable. And the last statement goes, for someone like me, it doesn't matter what kind of government we have. And across the countries, and on average, a large majority, nearly 7 in 10 Africans, report that tell us that they prefer democracy to any other kind of government. And as you can see, the support for democracy varies a lot across the countries, but is mostly in the majority for most countries. It is only in South Africa and Angola where we see low levels of support for democracy. Otherwise, support for democracy is very solid. And in addition to the support for democracy, the support for democratic norms on the continent, be it support for presidential term limits, the president being compliant with court decisions, elections as the best way to choose leaders, support for parliamentary oversight, multi-party competition, and accountable governance. All of these norms have stayed relatively the same over the last decade. And so from the perspective of citizens, in terms of people's having democratic attitudes, norms, and values, and being supportive of those values and norms, we have not seen any wavering in the African public over time, at least over the last decade. And so we take this to mean, when we talk about the decline of democracy, it does not necessarily mean there's an erosion of democratic norms among the population. As we can see here, support for democratic norms and general support for democracy has remained solid over time. And when I want to particularly look at presidential term limits on the continent, across all 34 countries we surveyed, there is no country that has a minority saying that they support term limits. Even in the country with the weakest support, we have a solid 60% that say they support presidential term limits. This goes from Mozambique, which is 60%, all the way up to Gabon that records 92%. For those of you who know about the politics of Gabon, you may know that Gabon doesn't have presidential term limits. But here's the case, this data does show that Gabonese are deeply in favor of having term limits. So at least in the case of Africa, we know that large majorities of citizens want democracy. They are deeply committed to democratic values and norms. And in addition to that, we don't usually stop there. We ask people whether or not they reject other forms of authoritarian rule. And this picture shows that we've asked people whether or not they disapprove of other forms of governance, whether it is one-man rule, one-party rule, or military rule. And resoundingly across the board and over time, we have seen a complete rejection of all these forms of rule. And so a combination of support for democratic norms and the rejection of authoritarian alternatives give us confidence that among ordinary people on the continent, democracy and democratic norms and values are still the preferred option, and they stand solidly by these norms and values. And so in terms of when we talk about resilience and resistance on the continent, even though it's a wave of democratic decline, which is as a result of the supply side deficit, it has not at least yet eroded the commitment, Africans' commitment to democracy and democratic norms. Now, to buttress this point, I think the pro-democracy protests in Sudan are partly a testament to the resistance to authoritarian, in this particular case, military rule. The latest Afrobarometer survey in Sudan actually shows that a majority, and this is 55% of Sudanese, say they reject military rule. You may also recall similar protests that took place in Eswatini. And in fact, in the last round of the Afrobarometer survey, we found that the proportion of people who say they have participated in protests has actually increased quite significantly. It started off when we started asking this question about attending protests. In 2011, we had about 10% of the population reporting that they have participated in protest march. And this has risen to almost close to 20% in 2019. Now, given the strong rejection of military rule across the continent, as you can see from this diagram, rejection of military rule ranges from a minority view in Burkina Faso at 44% and all the way up to 91% in Morocco. And on average, as I said, 74% of Africans say they reject military rule. But some may point out that Africans in some countries have celebrated military coups in countries like Mali and Guinea. Then how does this square with the resounding rejection of military rule on the continent? I will soon draw on the Afrobarometer data to show that these two cases are actually highly consistent with the widespread commitment to democracy and democratic norms on the continent. For starters, the celebrations that greeted the military interventions in Mali and Guinea may give the wrong impression that Africans support military rule, or at least some Africans support military rule. But this couldn't be far from the evidence, or the truth, if I should say. Rejection of military rule, as shown here, is high and has been so over the last decades. In the last Afrobarometer survey, rejection of military rule is a majority view across all countries. If we zoom into the two case studies, Mali and Guinea, where we had people celebrating on the streets because of the military intervention, 70% of Malians and 76% of Guineans reject military rule. I will argue here that the celebration of the military interventions in the two countries actually demonstrates the popular resistance to bad governance in Africa. And by bad governance, this could be bad economic governance, political governance, or both. In our surveys preceding the military coup in Mali, a growing number of Malians reported to us that the country was going in the wrong direction. In fact, I must state here that this is one of the critical indicators in the Afrobarometer survey of potential trouble for any country. Whenever we see a consistent uptick in the proportion of people saying the country is going in the wrong direction, then we know that there's potential for trouble in the horizon. The celebration of the coup was thus largely due to popular frustration with poor economic governance or management and a popular desire to change the status quo. And this is the case of Mali. And so, as I mentioned, Malians felt frustrated about the economic conditions. They felt frustrated about the direction of the country. And so when the military intervened, it felt like it was a good thing for them in the sense that it allows for a change in the status quo, or at least a stop to what they thought was a declining trend of events. In the case of Guinea, you may all know that President Alpha Condé chose to manipulate the constitution to extend his term. And in fact, at the time he was doing this, the Afrobarometer survey actually showed that close to 8 in 10 Guineans support presidential term limits. And Condé made the mistake of tampering with the constitution in order to go against the popular wishes of the people, which was that presidents must respect presidential term limits. And this was an overwhelming majority. And by so doing, when there was a military intervention, people found that to be a relief in the sense that they were trying, it was a process of stopping or blocking a non-democratic process that led to Alpha Condé getting a third term. Here too, we saw celebrations on the streets, and the celebrations were largely because of the bad governance that they had experienced under Alpha Condé. So in both cases, I highlight these cases to make the point that, as we can see here, Africans reject military rule. They may favor a temporary intervention of the military, but it doesn't mean that they are in support of military rule. Any military regime that stays in power for more than a period of time, for much longer than they are welcome, I'm sure that the frustrations of citizens is going to boil again, as we have seen in the case of Sudan lately. Now I want to turn and talk about the big monster in our midst, the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 has disrupted a lot of what we used to consider normal life, including this conference, which has gone entirely virtual. This has kept us wondering whether or how the pandemic may have changed popular commitments to democracy in Africa. In the 15 countries that we were able to survey following the lifting of COVID-related restrictions, popular support for democracy and democratic norms and resistance to authoritarian alternatives has remained quite strong. Here, we see that close to 7 in 10 Africans say that they prefer democracy to all forms of government in 2018. This was before the COVID lockdowns. And then after the COVID lockdowns, when we surveyed in the same 16 countries, we had 69% reporting that they support democracy. And so for at least the 16 countries that we've been able to work in both pre and post the COVID lockdowns, we have seen no change at all in popular support for democracy. But notwithstanding Africans' resolute support for democracy and their resistance to authoritarian regimes, Africans were willing to exercise some flexibility because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in this particular case, most Africans were willing to accept restrictions of their freedoms in order to help halt the spread. About 70% reporting that it was okay for the government to use military and security forces to enforce public health mandates. And we had about 53% also saying it is justified for the government to postpone elections or limit campaigns during the pandemic. And here a split decision in terms of censoring the media, about 50% saying that it is justified for the government to censor the media because of the pandemic. But I want to draw attention to countries where this acceptance was not as widespread as we have it here in the averages. So averagely across the continent, the use of security forces because of the public health issues was widely accepted by Africans, except in Niger, where only 38% accepted it. When it came to postponing elections in the 15 countries that we surveyed, here there's quite a bit of variation. So in countries like Senegal, the Gambia, Zambia, and Niger, postponing the elections or limiting political campaigns was much more unacceptable for these countries. But of course, for several other countries, especially in Liberia, Mauritius, and Morocco, we had well over 70% or more saying that they would accept postponing elections or that it is justified for the government to postpone elections or limit campaigns. I should highlight here, especially in the case of Zambia, that the elections in Zambia that took place in 2020 were about 8 months away to the elections when the survey was conducted. And now on hindsight, we'll see why Zambians were so resistant to postponing the elections, because there was change in the horizon and it is not something they would have accepted under any circumstances, and not even the COVID-19 pandemic. Here too, in terms of censoring the media, this was much lower and much less accepted by Africans even under the COVID-19 pandemic. And this also goes to show us Africans' commitment to media freedoms, especially, and of course, a democratic norm, which is the media playing their watchdog and oversight role of public officials. And so it was a split decision, 50% on average saying that it was justified for the government to censor the media. While they may have accepted some anti-democratic practices for health and safety reasons, Africans are largely concerned that some of these practices may become permanent, or at least not easily reversed, as politicians may seek to use it to increase their power. And so when we asked our respondents across the 15 countries we surveyed, here you can see a majority in most countries report that they are worried somewhat, or actually very worried, that politicians will use the COVID as an excuse to increase their power. And this is something that should concern all of us, because before the COVID lockdowns, civic space was gradually on the decline. And so COVID may have just exacerbated the situation where people are getting increasingly worried that governments may continue to restrict civic space just using the COVID-19 as an excuse. The other area I want to turn to in terms of resistance from the African publics is external assistance. Overall, we have seen that while Africans recognize the fact that foreign assistance is a necessary part of their lives and that their governments routinely seek and receive such assistance, Africans still insist that they want to have control over their own agenda. And I think this is another level of resistance from the African public, apart from resisting democratic change. First, we find here that a solid majority, that is 65%, say that it is important to finance their own development from their own resources. And this is a question about whether or not Africans should rely on external resources or finance it from their own resources, even if that means paying more taxes. And here we see majority of Africans going with the option that they should finance their development from their own resources. And this is, of course, a refreshing picture in the sense that people are truly committed and they probably want to protect their national sovereignty and pride. And so financing development from their own resources seem to be something that Africans are largely in support of. But even when they receive foreign assistance, Africans still generally insist that their government should be the ones who have control over decisions about how to allocate and spend those resources. And so here you can see 55% on average saying that conditionalities on development aid should not be the case, that their country's governments, when they are giving loans, should be allowed to make decisions by themselves. And when we ask the question about whether or not loan conditionalities that are tied, they will be acceptable or amenable to loans that are tied to promoting, or conditionalities that require the promotion of democracy and respect for human rights. In this particular case, what we realize is it is much more varied, even though we have a small majority, 51%, saying that loan conditionalities should not be tied to the promotion of democracy. We do see that for quite a large number of countries, it is a majority view. And in fact, in countries like Eswatini, Liberia, and Gabon, there's a large majority that support the case that loan conditionalities that enforce or try to put in promoting democracy as a requirement is largely accepted in these three countries. But as you can see, there seem to be wide variations, even though there's a leaning in most countries towards receiving loans that are conditioned on promoting democracy. All right, so that is briefly about the Afrobarometer and talking about the theme of resistance and resilience. And that is what I have to share with you. But now I want to turn briefly and just highlight some of the ways that the Afrobarometer data has been used in policy and decision making. So starting first, let's look at how the Afrobarometer data has been used in policy and decision making, and as well as in research. I'll start off by listing the types of institutions and agencies that use the Afrobarometer data regularly for their own work. So the Ibrahim Index for African Governance, the Economist Intelligence Unit, United Nations Development Program, the World Bank, and others have used the Afrobarometer data extensively in their work. We also have started to construct what we call the SDG scorecards using the Afrobarometer data. And we have data that can track up to 12 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals indicators. And we have often said that the Afrobarometer does provide a reality check. In other words, when governments present their data in terms of their progress towards certain sustainable development indicators, the Afrobarometer data does provide a reality check on those, and we are promoting our Sustainable Development Goals scorecards to be used side by side with government data, just so that we have the citizen perspective, the experience side of government's interventions when it comes to progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. I also mentioned two cases where the Afrobarometer data was used to inform policy decisions. First, in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone launched what they call the Pay No Bribe campaign, and this campaign actually cited the Afrobarometer data as one of the sources for why they had to launch this campaign, because our data showed that perceptions of corruption was increasing in Sierra Leone, and the government took this on and decided to launch this campaign. The second was in Botswana, where our data did show a relative tolerance for homosexuality in Botswana. And the High Court in that country actually cited the Afrobarometer data to state that the country is probably, ready to accept or tolerate or at least embrace homosexuality in that country. I should add here that unfortunately, some of you may have heard about Ghana and the bill in Parliament to criminalize LGBTQI issues. They also rightly cited the Afrobarometer data as showing a high intolerance for homosexuality. And that is a truth from the Afrobarometer survey, that a large majority of Ghanaians do not tolerate or will not tolerate homosexuality. But then the unfortunate move on the part of the members of parliament who are promoting the bill to criminalize LGBTQI people is that rather than take this data to mean that there's a vulnerable group in society that needs protection and to come up with a law to protect them, they have taken the opposite by going for a bill that criminalizes LGBTQI people. And I think this is a very wrong and bad use of data, because in any democracy, and if you are committed to democratic values, a country or data points like this should be used to protect the vulnerable and not to rather criminalize them. So it's an unfortunate use of the data in the case of Ghana, but overall, we have seen an uptick and a positive use of our data, which is why we are in this space and working to ensure that we bring citizen voices to influence decisions that are made in any country. So the final thing I want to do here is just show you a short video clip about the extent to which the Afrobarometer actually goes to collect our data. And of course, it is a tasking process, but you will see it from the video for yourself.
Yeah, trying to get it. I was first EA, and this place is the town, the offshore of Barclayville or Hewlett. In order to arrive there, you have to navigate this path, and there's a route.
Afrobarometer does public attitude surveys in Africa. When you hear the word surveys, you might think of phone interviews or online polls. For Afrobarometer, that's not quite how it works. Since 1999, Afrobarometer has interviewed more than 250,000 Africans in 38 countries about their experiences and evaluations of quality of life, governance, democracy, and other topics. That means our national partners have sent teams to more than 250,000 African homes, no matter where they are. A 2-day hike away in the outback of Madagascar, or the mountains of Lesotho, in the slums of Lagos, or the gated communities of Johannesburg, in unstable or conflict zones, in the flooded backcountry of Zambia or Liberia. Why? Because to make the voices of average citizens count in public policymaking, Afrobarometer is committed to getting reliable data that is truly representative of each country's population. So we use a scientific method that gives every adult citizen in every region of the country, in remote rural areas, as well as in cities, the same chance of being interviewed. From that list, we randomly select a set number of enumeration areas. Some areas will be within driving distance. Others may be days away by car, by bus, on foot, by canoe. Every one of our teams could tell stories about every one of their surveys. Here, we can only share a few.
One of our team members, Francis from Uganda, he was down in Zambia monitoring some field work and just helping oversee the implementation of the survey there. And he was out in the field with one of the Zambian teams in a remote rural area. And they were trying to get to their site where they were supposed to do their interviews. And they came across a bridge over a river that was too broken down to use. There was still some structure there, but they could not get across it.
We decided to press on and go take a look at the bridge and see if we could fix it. I banked on my engineering training and rallied the team, and we got assistance from the community. There were many men and children who were willing to assist. They came with cutting equipment, some axes, hangers, And the broken bridge was in the middle of a forest. So we were able to cut down logs and trees and collected some strappings from the forest that we used to tie together logs and trees, branches to make our makeshift bridge. We were not so sure it would work because the logs were all wet. And at one point, as we attempted to drive our field vehicle over the bridge, we feared that the vehicle could actually fall into the water. But luckily, we managed. We drove the car across, we made it to the other side safely. Our team was able to work in the two villages as assigned, and we used the other road to travel back to Mwinilunga successfully.
At times, Afrobarometer survey teams have some very close calls. During our round 6 survey in Kenya, for example, a team was to survey 3 districts in the far northeast near the Somalian border, a region known for criminal and terrorist activity, where buses move in convoys with police or military escort. One of the 5 team members missed the bus in Nairobi, so about halfway to their final destination, the other 4 team members got off to wait for him, letting their bus go on without them.
As they were waiting, about 10 in the morning, there was a curfew, there were sirens, there were military operation, there were police operation in Wajir, and ambulances and sirens and a lot of security activity. And when they went to inquire what exactly had happened, it turned out that the bus that they had come with from Nairobi, the bus that they had decided to disembark from to wait for their colleague that had remained in Nairobi, that bus had been ambushed by the Al-Shabaab, who had laid an ambush along the way between Wajir and Mandera. A number of people were killed in that particular bus, including some of the police officers who were escorting the bus to Mandera.
During ensuing military operations in the area, the national partner was able to get the team back to Nairobi on a UN helicopter. After monitoring the security situation for a few days, they decided to head back out to the 3 districts as planned. Not all our trips are quite so dramatic. Sometimes you just have to go with the flow, as one of our round 6 teams discovered when they were sent to a village in northern Malawi that could only be reached by boat. 4 of our 5 team members had never been on a boat before. They asked if they could substitute a place that was easier to get to.
But of course, the national investigator said, no, if this enumeration area has been selected and it is in Malawi, then you have to go there. So anyway, they hired a boat. It took them about 6 hours to actually get to the town of Mamrowe on the water. They got there, they did their interviews. And then on their way back, it's about 2 hours while they were on the boat, it turned out that the boat had run out of petrol. So they were stuck in the middle of the water. Most likely, very few, if any of them, could swim. And naturally, I think they started to panic. And I should have mentioned that they actually also had a police officer escort them on the boat. So when they were heading back and they'd run out of gas, they tried to flag some boats that were passing by. And because they had this police officer in uniform, the other boats didn't want to stop because they may be worried that I don't know whether they didn't even have the permits to be on the lake. So anyway, they eventually had to rely, I think, on just the waves on the lake to push them. And I think it ended up taking them like 9 hours to eventually get back to the shore on the other side of the lake.
Safely back from their face-to-face interviews, each survey team brings thousands of data points, which Afrobarometer will compile, analyze, and disseminate to policymakers, journalists, activists, and scholars all over the world. This is how the voices of African citizens are heard in the halls of power, helping to shape policies that affect their lives. This is what makes Afrobarometer the world's leading source of reliable data on what Africans are thinking. Behind the data, we must never forget, are the citizens who agree to share their opinions with us, and the women and men who go to every corner of the continent to ask citizens what they think.
Okay, so that's it from me. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to responding to any questions that you may have. Thank you.